The date was July 6th, 1988. 120 miles off the coast of Aberdeen, the North Sea is a dark, restless expanse of gray water. Here, rising from the waves like a steel fortress, stood the Piper Alpha. It was not just an oil rig. It was a titan of industry, a hub of iron and fire that produced 10% of the North Sea's total oil and gas. At 29 years old, Joe Meenan was just another face in the crowd of 228 men who called this jagged structure home for 2 weeks at a time. To Joe, a scaffolder from Glasgow, this was a routine shift. He was only 1 day away from finishing his stint. By Friday morning, he would be on a helicopter, heading back to the quiet coastal town of Stonehaven to see his friends and family. The mood in his shared accommodation was light, even celebratory. His roommate, David Campbell, had just shared the kind of news that makes a man feel invincible. He was going to be a father. But the North Sea is an unforgiving place for those who ignore the scent of danger. For weeks, a subtle, sweet, and sickly smell had been drifting through the steel corridors. It was the smell of gas. It was everywhere. Joe would later swear he could smell it even inside the living quarters, a ghost in the machine that everyone ignored because the oil had to keep flowing. At 10 o'clock that night, Joe and 40 other crew members were huddled in the cinema, distracted by the flickering screen and the comfort of Mars bars. They didn't know that on the other side of the rig, a catastrophic error was unfolding. A gas pump, missing a vital safety valve for maintenance, had been activated by mistake. In an instant, the routine of the night was shattered by a sound that wasn't just a noise, it was a physical blow. The whole platform rocked violently, swaying back and forth as if the ocean itself had tried to uproot it. The cinema roof buckled, chunks of insulation and metal raining down as the lights flickered and died. Pitch darkness swallowed the room. In that void, the first sounds of the Piper Alpha disaster weren't commands or sirens. They were screams. Panic is a cold, sharp thing that cuts through safety training in seconds. As Joe scrambled out of the wreckage of the theater, he waited for the alarms. He waited for the Tannoy system to crackle to life with instructions from the control room. But there was only a terrifying, heavy silence. The first explosion had already obliterated the nerve center of the rig. There were no orders coming. There was no plan. Joe tried to reach his lifeboat station, his mind clinging to the drills he'd practiced a dozen times, but as he moved toward the west side of the platform, he met a wall of men retreating. Their faces were etched with a visceral reality that no training manual could prepare them for. The fire was oil-based, thick and acrid. It created a black smoke so dense it felt like a physical weight. If you stepped into it without breathing apparatus, your lungs would seize in less than 3 minutes. In the chaos, the group of friends who had just been laughing about their trip home was torn apart. Joe became separated from David Campbell, the man who was supposed to go home to a new life. He would never see him again. Imagine being in a place where there is no one to hear your scream, where every breath feels like swallowing hot glass, and the very floor beneath your feet is beginning to groan with the weight of its own destruction. Joe was now 29 years old, standing on the edge of a melting world, and he was about to realize that the safety he had been promised was a lie. The society of the doomed was forming in the galley, men trusting in fireproof walls and ventilation systems, but Joe felt a different instinct. He felt the structure twisting. He heard the yawning noises of metal being pushed beyond its limits. He knew that staying still was a death sentence. What would you have done? Would you have stayed in the designated safe area, clinging to the rules, or would you have walked out into the black smoke toward a 175-foot drop into a freezing sea? Joe looked at the men around him, men who were choosing to stay because they were told to, and he made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He walked away. He headed for the helideck, climbing higher into the belly of the beast, unaware that the structure was already disintegrating beneath him. The tragedy of the Piper Alpha wasn't just the fire. It was the trust of the men who believed they were being saved, while the seabed was already waiting for them 475 feet below. Joe Meenan was moving, his heart hammering against his ribs, stepping toward a ledge that offered no guarantee of life, only the certainty of a terrifying choice. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 2? Joe Meenan estimates it took exactly 6 seconds to hit the North Sea, but in those 6 seconds, he lived an entire lifetime. As he stepped into the void, the air around him wasn't just hot, it was a physical weight, a superheated pressure cooker that threatened to sear his lungs before he even cleared the railing. Behind him, the multi-billion-dollar Piper Alpha rig was no longer a pinnacle of engineering. It was a crumbling, melting skeleton of steel, disintegrating into the black waves of the Scottish coast. 167 men would not return home that night. They were husbands, brothers, and sons who followed every protocol and listened to every drill. Imagine standing on a helideck, looking down at a 175-foot drop into a freezing, oil-slicked abyss, while a gas-fed sun roars at your back. Most men did what they were trained to do. They sought out the designated safe room. It was fireproof, ventilated, and promised survival. But in the deadliest offshore disaster in history, that safe room became a coffin. We are dissecting the minute-by-minute psychology of a catastrophe where the rules of survival were rewritten in blood. Why did the very area designed to save these men become the site of the greatest tragedy? As the structure began to groan and yawn under the heat, Joe Meenan faced the impossible summary of his life. He chose a jump to certain death over the false security of a melting room. But even as he fell, the nightmare was only beginning. What does the heat of a gas-fed sun do to a human body before it even touches the flames? And once you hit the water, how do you survive the wreckage of a world falling on top of you? This is the visceral reality of 175 feet into hell. To understand the heat on the Piper Alpha that night, you have to stop thinking about a normal fire. This wasn't a house fire or a bonfire. It was a gas-fed sun, a pressurized inferno that turned the North Sea air into a physical weight. Before Joe Meenan ever touched the flames, the air itself began to betray him. When natural gas under extreme pressure ignites, the thermal radiation travels at the speed of light, vibrating the molecules in everything it touches. For the men on the helideck, the heat was a silent, invisible wall that hit them with the force of a hammer. In those few seconds before Joe made his choice, the temperature around him likely spiked toward levels that would melt lead. This kind of heat doesn't just burn the skin, it cooks the air inside your lungs. Every breath Joe took felt like swallowing molten glass, a searing, dry heat that threatened to blister his throat from the inside out. There is a sense of cosmic vertigo that takes over when your world shifts from a mundane Wednesday night movie to a fight for oxygen in a blacked-out void. One moment you are laughing at a screen with a Mars bar in your hand, and the next, the very atmosphere is trying to incinerate you. Joe's arms flailed as he plummeted through the air, and even though he didn't hit the central fireball, the radiated heat was so intense that it literally peeled the skin from his limbs mid-flight. It is a terrifying biological reality. The heat was traveling faster than he was falling. His body was being toasted by infrared energy while he was still 50 feet above the water. The transition into total darkness was not just visual. It was a sensory deprivation that made the platform feel like it was floating in outer space rather than the North Sea. He was falling through a column of acrid, oily smoke that was so thick it had its own texture, a greasy soot that coated his tongue and eyes. This loneliness makes a person hollow from within, rotting the mind with the realization that the structure of your world, the steel, the wood, the rules, is literally disintegrating into the waves. He plummeted for nearly 6 seconds. That is enough time to think about your entire life. But for Joe, there was only one thought screaming through his mind. What have I done? He had traded the melting floor of the helideck for a 175-foot drop into a black abyss. At that height, hitting the water is like hitting a sheet of concrete. If he hit at the wrong angle, his ribs would shatter and puncture his lungs instantly. If he hit the right way, he would still be driven so deep into the frigid depths that he might never find the surface again. But as he fell, the groaning and yawning of the platform echoed above him, the sound of 30,000 tons of steel twisting like tinfoil. It was the sound of a world ending. The bodies of the men who stayed behind in the galley were already sealed in their fate, destined to sink 475 feet to the seabed when the structure finally gave up the ghost. Joe was between two deaths, the fire above and the ice below. The heat followed him down, a scorching reminder of the pressure-fed monster he was leaving behind. It was an unforgiving place, a vertical gauntlet where the air was fire and the destination was a freezing grave. He hit the water at over 70 miles per hour. The impact was a physical shock that slammed the remaining air out of his chest, plunging him into a silent, cold world that was the exact opposite of the hell he had just left. Now he had to figure out which way was up before his lungs gave out in the dark. Would you have jumped? Or would you have stayed in the safe room, trusting the experts who told you to wait for a rescue that was never coming? To understand the sheer scale of the machine Joe Meenan called home, you have to understand the era of the Great North Sea oil boom. It was 1988, and Scotland's coast was being transformed into a forest of steel. Joe was only 29 years old, a scaffolder from Glasgow, who had moved to the quiet coastal town of Stonehaven to chase the high wages of the offshore life. For men like Joe, the rigs weren't just job sites. They were isolated city-states, cities of iron rising out of the gray, churning waves of the North Sea. Piper Alpha was the crown jewel of this industrial empire, accounting for a staggering 10% of all North Sea production. At its peak, this single platform was pumping out 300,000 barrels of oil every single day. It was the world's most productive oil and gas hub, a massive labyrinth of pipes and pressure valves that connected a web of neighboring platforms to the shore. But there was a hidden cost to this efficiency. Because the platform was so vital to the economy, the work never stopped. Not for maintenance, not for upgrades, and certainly not for safety. In July of 1988, major construction was underway to modernize the rig, but the oil kept flowing. Joe remembers the atmosphere during those final days as a strange mix of high-energy excitement and a creeping, low-level dread. He was only 1 day away from finishing his 2-week stint. He was already thinking about his family, about the Friday morning flight that would take him back to dry land. He shared a room with 3 other men, and the mood was lighter than usual. They were laughing, making plans, and celebrating the news that David Campbell, one of Joe's roommates, was about to become a father for the first time. But beneath the camaraderie, something felt wrong. The platform began to smell. It wasn't the usual scent of salt and machinery. It was the sharp, sweet, unmistakable odor of gas. Joe would later recall that the smell was everywhere, drifting through the corridors and even seeping into the living quarters. In an environment like Piper Alpha, where a single spark can turn $1 billion asset into a funeral pyre, that smell should have been a siren. But on the Piper, The smell of gas was just the smell of money. The men had grown used to the fragile boom. They trusted the fireproofing, the positive pressure ventilation in the galley, and the expertise of the managers who sat in the central control room. They assumed that the systems designed to protect them were as solid as the steel jackets pinned to the seabed. They didn't know that a non-operational pump was missing a vital safety valve. They didn't know that the communication between the maintenance crews and the operators had completely broken down. As 9 p.m. approached on that Wednesday evening, Joe and about 40 other crew members headed to the rig's cinema to relax. They grabbed some Mars bars, settled into their seats, and let the flickering screen drown out the groans of the platform. It was a moment of absolute, routine normalcy. It was the kind of comfort that makes you forget you are sitting on top of a pressurized bomb in the middle of a cold, unforgiving ocean. No one in that room realized that in less than an hour, the safe world they lived in would cease to exist. They were living on borrowed time, and the debt was about to be called in. Would you have ignored that smell, trusting the engineers and the experts to keep you safe? Or would that scent of gas have been enough to make you pack your bags and demand a seat on the next helicopter out? The line between a routine shift and a historic disaster is often thinner than we want to believe. Would you like me to continue with the next chapter, detailing the moment the first explosion ripped through the cinema? July in the North Sea is a strange time, a season where the sun barely dips below the horizon and the water looks like hammered lead. For Joe Meenan, a 29-year-old scaffolder from Glasgow, the date on the calendar was more important than the weather. It was Wednesday, July 6, 1988. He had survived another 2-week stint in one of the most hostile working environments on the planet, and in less than 24 hours, he would be sitting on a helicopter headed for the mainland. The high spirits on the Piper Alpha were infectious that evening, a collective sigh of relief shared by over 200 men who were just ready to go home. In the cramped living quarters, Joe joked with his 3 roommates, the air thick with the smell of laundry detergent and the kind of easy camaraderie that only develops when you're 120 miles from the nearest coastline. Among them was David Campbell. David was radiant that night, buoyed by the kind of news that makes a man feel invincible. He had just found out he was going to be a father. He talked about the future, about the life waiting for him back in Scotland, and the group shared in that quiet, domestic joy. They were young, they were earning good money, and the world felt wide open. But beneath the laughter and the plans for the weekend, there was a vibration that never quite stopped. It was the constant, low-frequency hum of a rig that was currently producing 10% of all the oil and gas in the North Sea. The Piper Alpha was a titan, a steel island pumping out 300,000 barrels of oil every single day. It was the world's most productive rig, a literal gold mine in the middle of the ocean. And that meant the pressure to keep the taps open was absolute. But productivity has a scent, and on the Piper Alpha, that scent was becoming impossible to ignore. Joe noticed it first in the corridors, then in the mess hall, and finally, even inside the sleeping quarters where the air was supposed to be filtered and safe. It was the sharp, metallic tang of raw gas. On a rig undergoing massive construction and upgrades, a certain amount of mechanical odor is expected, but this was different. It was persistent. It felt heavy. The rig was a chaotic mess of ongoing maintenance and record-breaking production, a dangerous overlap where safety valves were being moved and pipes were being rerouted while the high-pressure flow never stopped. Joe felt a gnawing unease, a survival instinct that told him something in the chemistry of the rig had shifted. He tried to shake the feeling as he and 40 other men settled into the cinema room around 9 p.m. He had grabbed a couple of Mars bars from the canteen, the sweet chocolate smell momentarily masking that underlying hint of methane. The room was dark, the seats were comfortable, and for a moment the industrial roar of the platform faded into the background of the movie. They were just men on a break, tired from a long day of scaffolding and welding, drifting into that peaceful headspace of the almost home stretch. David Campbell was somewhere in the dark beside him, perhaps still thinking about the child he would never get to hold. They were safe in the world's most advanced offshore fortress, protected by fireproofing and elite engineering, or so they believed. At 10 p.m., the smell of gas stopped being a nuisance. It became the spark that ended the world. Would you like me to continue with the next chapter, where we witness the first explosion and the chaos inside the cinema? The first explosion didn't just break the silence. It shattered the reality of everyone on Piper Alpha. Imagine sitting in a dark cinema, the smell of chocolate from a Mars bar still lingering in the air, when the world suddenly tilts on its axis. A massive, concussive force slammed into the platform, making the steel deck beneath Joe Meenan's feet buck like a living thing. The ceiling of the cinema groaned under the pressure before sections of it simply gave way, crashing down into the rows of seats. In a heartbeat, the flickering screen died, replaced by a pitch blackness so thick you could almost taste it. Panic is a cold, sharp blade. It cuts through training and logic in seconds. Inside that darkened room, 40 men were suddenly trapped in a box of twisted metal and rising heat. You could hear the screams before you could see the exits, a raw, primal sound that echoed off the collapsing walls. Joe felt the disorientation wash over him like a wave of ice water. One moment he was thinking about his flight home on Friday, and the next he was scrambling through the dark, his hands grazing the jagged edges of fallen debris. The emergency lights failed to flicker on. There was no authoritative voice over the intercom to tell them where to go. The main control room had been vaporized in those first few seconds, taking the platform's brain along with it. Without the tannoy system, there were no alarms, just the haunting sound of the wind and the far-off roar of something very large and very hungry. Joe pushed through the heavy doors, spilling out into the corridors, but the safety he expected to find was a ghost. The air outside the cinema was already changing. It was no longer the salty North Sea breeze, but a heavy, acrid soup of burning oil. This was the visceral reality of a high-pressure gas fire. The smoke was a deep, oily black that didn't just obscure your vision. It burned your eyes and filled your lungs with the taste of pennies and scorched rubber. Joe knew the statistics of survival in this environment. Without breathing apparatus, you had maybe 3 minutes before the smoke turned your blood into poison. He tried to follow his training, pushing toward his designated lifeboat station on the west side of the rig. But as he turned the corner, he was met by a wall of men retreating, their faces pale and streaked with soot. They told him the way was gone. The heat on that side of the platform was so intense it was already blistering the paint off the bulkheads. The lifeboats, those orange pods of salvation, were hanging in a furnace. In the chaos of the shifting crowds, Joe looked around for his friends. David Campbell, the man who had just shared the news of his unborn child, was nowhere to be seen. The group from the cinema was fragmenting, dissolving into the smoke like shadows. It's easy to judge the movements of men in a disaster from the safety of your living room, but in that moment there was no plan. There was only the stupid decision, or the lucky one. Joe found himself drawn toward the galley area. It was supposed to be a fortress within the fortress. The galley was designed with fireproofing and a positive pressure ventilation system intended to keep smoke out. As he stepped inside, he found nearly 100 men already there, huddled on the floor, pressing wet dish towels to their faces. It felt like a sanctuary, a quiet bubble in the middle of a screaming hellscape. But as Joe sat there, listening to the platform groan, He felt a nagging dread in the pit of his stomach. The structure was making noises he didn't like. You could hear yawning and grinding sounds, the literal sound of steel losing its temper. The platform wasn't just on fire, it was starting to melt. Every few minutes, a smaller explosion would rock the room, followed by the sound of windows shattering. Each broken pane was a fresh invitation for the black smoke to enter their sanctuary. Joe looked at the men around him. Some were praying, others were staring blankly at the walls, paralyzed by the shock of how quickly their world had disintegrated. He realized then that the safe area might actually be a trap. The fire was growing, fueled by the massive pipelines of neighboring rigs that were still pumping gas into the heart of the inferno. Piper Alpha was no longer a producer of energy. It had become a giant blowtorch. He stood up, his mind racing. He called out to the men nearby, suggesting they move higher toward the helideck. It was a gamble. Moving meant leaving the fireproofing behind and stepping back into the acrid dark. But Joe could feel the heat through the floor. The structure was bucking again, twisting as the support legs began to buckle under the weight and the heat. 6 men looked at Joe when he asked if they were coming. They stayed seated, their eyes fixed on the fireproof doors. They had been told to stay in the designated safe area, and they were going to follow those orders to the letter. Joe offered a quiet good luck and stepped back out into the smoke, a move that would haunt his dreams for decades. Those 6 men would never leave that room. Their sanctuary would eventually become their coffin, plummeting hundreds of feet to the seabed when the rig finally gave up the ghost. As Joe climbed higher, the scale of the disintegration became undeniable. He reached the helideck, and for the first time he saw the outside world. It was a vision from a nightmare. The sky was orange, and the sea below was reflecting the glow of a fire that stood hundreds of feet tall. The firefighting rig Tharos was nearby, spraying arcs of water that looked like tiny needles against the wall of flame. Then came the second major explosion. It wasn't a bang, it was a physical blow that knocked everyone on the deck flat. A gas line from the tartan platform had ruptured, turning the rig into a sun. The heat was so sudden and so fierce that Joe felt the skin on his arms begin to tighten and sizzle. The air itself seemed to ignite. In that moment of total disorientation, the group of 14 men on the deck broke apart. No words were spoken. They just ran. Joe stood at the edge of the helideck, looking down into the dark void of the North Sea, 175 feet below. Behind him was a fire that was melting the world. In front of him was a fall that few had ever survived. He was driving on the rims now, his options stripped away until only one remained. Would you have stepped back into the fire, or would you have taken the leap into the unknown? Would you like me to continue with the next chapter, where Joe makes the heart-stopping jump into the North Sea? The routine of the night was shattered at precisely 10 o'clock. Deep within the steel bowels of the platform, a non-operational gas pump was activated in error. It was a small mistake with a cosmic price tag. Because of ongoing upgrades, a single safety valve was missing from the line, leaving a gap in the armor of the world's most productive oil rig. When the gas hit that empty space, it didn't just leak, it erupted. A fireball roared through the lower decks, and the shockwave slammed into the cinema like a physical fist. Joe felt the entire platform rock back and forward as if a giant had kicked the stilts. Above him, the cinema roof buckled and collapsed in a rain of acoustic tiles and twisted metal. Then came the darkness. It wasn't the soft dimming of a theater. It was an absolute, suffocating blackout that swallowed 40 men in an instant. Joe waited for the sirens. He waited for the calm, authoritative voice of the tannoy system to guide them to safety. But the silence from the speakers was more terrifying than the explosion itself. The main control room, the brain of the Piper Alpha, had been vaporized in the first seconds. There were no alarms because there was no one left to trigger them. In the pitch black, the room transformed into a cinema of screams. Men were scrambling over seats, their hands clawing at the air, desperate to find the exit before the heat arrived. Joe finally burst through the doors into the corridor, but the world he knew was gone. To reach his designated lifeboat station, he had to cross the west side of the platform, but he was met by a wall of black, acrid smoke. This wasn't wood fire smoke. This was the burning of crude oil. It was a heavy, poison curtain that could liquefy a man's lungs in less than 3 minutes. Joe watched as the shadows of other men emerged from the haze, their eyes wide with the realization that the primary escape routes were already death traps. In the chaos and the blinding soot, Joe felt the terrifying snap of isolation. He looked around for David Campbell and his other roommates, but the frenzy had swept them apart. He didn't know it then, but as David's face vanished into the smoke, it was the last time Joe would ever see the man who was just days away from becoming a father. Desperation forced Joe to improvise. He grabbed a dish towel, soaking it with whatever water he could find, and pressed the damp, rough fabric against his face. The texture of the wet cloth was his only lifeline, a thin filter against the poison air that tasted like scorched metal. He tried to move toward the galley, the designated safe zone, but the rig was beginning to talk to him in a language of agony. He could hear groaning and yawning noises vibrating through the floorboards. It was the sound of tens of thousands of tons of steel beginning to melt and twist as the structure disintegrated. The protocol said to stay put and wait for instructions, but the protocol was written for a world that no longer existed. Joe followed the crowd to the galley, the designated safe zone, but inside he felt the floor begin to buckle. Would you have stayed in the safe room as the walls began to moan, or would you have risked the smoke to find another way out?